A teapot cooled. Before the truth did, a Miss Marple puzzle. The silver teapot sat on the lace tablecloth, a convex mirror distorting the world around it. It was an imposing vessel, heavy and Georgian, with a snout like a judgmental swan, and a handle of carved ivory that had yellowed, much like the teeth of the woman who owned it. In the curved reflection of the silver, the grey sky looked more ominous. The manicured hedges of Greystone Manor more like prison walls, and the faces of the guests gathered on the terrace appeared stretched, pulled thin by tension rather than optics. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wicker chair that creaked with every shift of her weight, observed the teapot with the appreciation of one who understands the weight of domestic rituals. She was knitting, her needles clicking a soft, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant rumble of thunder. The wool was a sensible shade of heather mixture, rough against the fingers, sturdy and unyielding. "Mary," Lady Althea Vance said. The voice was not loud, yet it cut through the humid afternoon air like a pair of embroidery scissors snapping shut. "Yes, Lady Althea." Mary, a woman of 30 who looked 50, flinched. She stood by the tea trolley, her hands red and chapped, hands that had scrubbed floors and polished brass, and weathered the erosion of constant servitude. She reached for the heavy silver pot. "Not that one!" Althea snapped. "The Earl Grey. You know perfectly well Julian detests the Assam." Julian Vance, leaning against the stone balustrade, laughed. It was a hollow sound, brittle as a dried leaf. He was a handsome man in a ruinous sort of way, who with the slightly frayed cuffs of a gentleman who has spent too much time in card rooms and not enough time at his tailor's. He spun a gold signet ring on his pinky finger. Round and round, a nervous tick that Miss Marple watched with mild interest. "Don't worry on my account, Aunt Althea," Julian said, his eyes scanning the garden as if looking for an exit. "Tea is tea. I'm not particular." "You are particular about nothing, Julian," Althea said, smoothing the silk of her dress over her knees. The fabric made a dry swish sound. "That is precisely why you're in your current predicament. A man who cannot distinguish between a proper blend and common dust is unlikely to distinguish between a sound investment and a swindle." Julian flushed. The red colour crept up his neck, staining the skin above his collar. He looked at Dr. Lowe, who was seated opposite Miss Marple, examining the bottom of his teacup with the weariness of a man who has seen too many tongues and taken too many pulses. Dr. Lowe had eyes of a piercing, steely grey, cold and clinical, and he met Julian's gaze with a slight shake of his head. "Be quiet," the gesture seemed to say. "Don't bait her." "The air feels heavy," Miss Marple murmured, counting her stitches, "like a damp sheet that won't dry." "It's going to storm," Dr. Lowe said. "My knee aches." "It's a better barometer than anything the meteorological office possesses." Lady Althea ignored them. She accepted the cup Mary handed her, a fragile bone china thing that looked ready to shatter in her grip. Althea did not drink. She merely held the cup, warming her arthritic fingers against the porcelain, using the heat as a weapon against the creeping chill of the afternoon. "I have asked you all here," Althea began, her voice dropping an octave, "because I have come to a decision." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds in the yew trees seemed to hold their breath. The only sound was the wind rustling the ivy on the manor walls, a sound like dry whispers. "Regarding the estate?" Julian asked. He tried to sound casual, but his hand tightened on the stone railing until his knuckles turned the colour of parsnip. "Regarding everything," Althea said. She took a sip, grimacing. "This is lukewarm. Mary, you are incompetent." I made it fresh, my lady." "Then you brought it out too slowly. Incompetence is a form of theft, Mary. You are stealing my time." Althea set the cup down with a sharp clink. "I am changing my will." Julian stopped spinning his ring. Mary froze, the silver milk jug hovering over a cup, a single drop of white hanging from the spout like a tear. Dr. Lowe sighed, a long exhale that whistled through his nose. "Is that wise, Althea?" the doctor asked. "In your condition, my condition is irrelevant. My mind is clear, clearer than it has been in years." She looked at Julian, then at Mary, her gaze sweeping over them like a broom sweeping dust from a step. "I have tolerated parasites for too long. I have supported gambling debts. I have housed incompetence. Tonight, I shall sign a new testament. It is already drafted. Mr. Henderson arrives at 6 o'clock to witness it." "And the contents?" Julian's voice cracked. "The bulk of the estate will go to the St. Mary's Home for Destitute Women," Althea said. A cruel smile touching her lips. "It seems fitting. Since none of you have learned the value of money, perhaps you should learn the reality of poverty." Thunder cracked overhead, a sharp, tearing sound that made Mary jump. The drop of milk finally fell. "You can't be serious," Julian whispered. "I am deadly serious," Althea said. "You have until 6 o'clock to make your peace with it. Now help me inside. The rain is starting." Big, heavy drops began to slap against the stone terrace, turning the pale grey slate to black. It began 4:15 p.m. The drawing room of Greystone Manor was a cavern of velvet and mahogany, designed to absorb light and sound. The curtains were drawn against the storm, but the flashes of lightning still managed to penetrate, illuminating the room in brief stuttering bursts of blue-white brilliance. And the fire in the grate spat and hissed, the logs damp, sending plumes of acrid smoke into the room that mingled with the smell of old beeswax and lavender. Miss Marple sat in a wingback chair near the fire, her knitting bag at her feet. She was working on a difficult turn in the heel of a sock, a manoeuvre that required concentration, yet her eyes flitted about the room, cataloguing the movements of the trapped animals. Julian was pacing. He walked from the window to the fireplace and back again, his shoes squeaking faintly on the Persian rug. He looked like a man walking the length of a cell. "She can't do it," he muttered. "It's madness." "She can do whatever she likes, Julian," Dr. Lowe said from the sofa. He was reading a medical journal, or pretending to. "It is her money." "It's family money," Julian snapped. He stopped and looked at the doctor. "You've treated her for 20 years. You know she's not right. Her heart, the medication makes her paranoid. You could testify to that." "I will do no such thing," Dr. Lowe said, turning a page. The paper rasped loud in the quiet room. "Althea is unpleasant, Julian. She's not insane." Mary entered from the hallway. She looked washed out, her uniform slightly rumpled. She carried a tray with a glass of water and a small bottle of pills. "Is she resting?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes, miss," Mary said. Her voice was trembling. "She's in the study. She said she didn't want to be disturbed until Mr. Henderson arrives." "Did she take her medicine?" Dr. Lowe asked. "She threw it at me," Mary whispered, looking down at her shoes. "She said I was trying to poison her." Julian let out a bark of laughter. Irony. She demanded fresh tea," Mary continued, her fingers twisting her apron strings, winding the fabric tight until the tips of her fingers turned white. She said if I didn't bring her a fresh pot, boiling hot, at exactly 4:30, she would dismiss me without a reference before the lawyer even gets here. Miss Marple glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. The pendulum swung back and forth, a brass disc slicing time into seconds. Tick-tock, tick-tock. "It is 4:20 now," Miss Marple noted. "I have the kettle on," Mary said. "I'm just waiting for the whistle." "Well, you'd better hop to it," Julian said, throwing himself into a chair. "The old dragon wants her firewater. Don't give her an excuse to kick you out early. God knows we're all on the chopping block." Mary hurried out. The door clicked shut. Miss Marple smoothed the wool over her lap. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. It felt less like a home and more like a waiting room at a train station where everyone knows the train has already crashed. "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "I shall have a peppermint." She reached into her bag, passed the balls of wool and the spare needles, and retrieved a small paper sack. The crinkle of the paper sounded explosively loud. She popped the sweet into her mouth. The taste was sharp, clean, and cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the room. From the kitchen, a faint whistle sounded. The kettle. "There she goes," Julian muttered, "the condemned woman's final meal." Dr. Lowe took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Julian, please, show some dignity. Dignity doesn't pay the bookmakers. A doctor." They sat in silence for 10 minutes. The rain lashed against the windows, a relentless drumming that sounded like fingers tapping, demanding entry. Miss Marple knitted. Knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. The pattern was simple, yet if one dropped a stitch, the whole thing could unravel. Life was very much the same. Then the scream came. It was not a cinematic scream. It was a short, sharp gasp of pure terror, followed by the crash of china shattering on floorboards. Dr. Lowe was on his feet instantly. Julian froze, his face draining of colour until he looked like wet dough. Miss Marple stabbed her needles into the ball of wool and rose with surprising speed. They rushed into the hallway. The door to the study was open. Mary was standing in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth, her body shaking so violently that her apron fluttered. On the floor, a tray lay upside down. Broken porcelain was scattered like jagged teeth. A dark puddle of tea was spreading across the carpet, steaming in the cool air of the hall. She, Mary choked. Dr. Lowe pushed past her. Miss Marple followed close behind, her sensible shoes stepping carefully over the broken shards. Lady Althea Vance sat in her high-backed leather chair behind the massive oak desk. Her head was lolled back against the leather. Her eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling with a look of supreme surprise. Her mouth was slightly open. She was absolutely still. Dr. Lowe rushed to her side, his fingers pressing against her neck. He held his wrist there for a long moment, his face grim. Then he pulled a small mirror from his pocket and held it to her lips. Nothing. No mist, no breath. She's gone, Dr. Lowe said quietly. Gone? Julian asked from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, unable to enter. You mean dead? Heart failure, by the looks of it, the doctor said, straightening up. Massive and instant, just as I feared. Miss Marple did not look at the body. She looked at the desk. Directly in front of the dead woman, untouched by the chaos of the fallen tray in the hallway, sat a cup of tea. It was half full. Beside it was a silver teapot, a smaller one for one person. It sat on a trivet. Miss Marple moved closer. The air in the study was cool. The window had been cracked open slightly, presumably to let in fresh air before the storm, and a draught was curling around the heavy velvet drapes. "When did this happen?" Julian asked, his voice shaking. Hard to say exactly," Dr. Lowe said, checking his watch. "But she's still warm. Within the last 10 or 15 minutes, certainly. Perhaps the shock of the storm." Miss Marple reached out a hand. Her fingers, withered and spotted with age, hovered over the silver teapot on the desk. She didn't touch the handle. She touched the belly of the pot. She recoiled instantly. "Careful, Jane," Dr. Lowe said. "That will be hot." Miss Marple looked at the doctor, then at the dead woman, and finally at the teapot. Her blue eyes, usually so gentle and vague, were suddenly sharp as needles. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It is." She looked at the puddle of tea in the hallway, the tea Mary had just brought, which was cooling rapidly on the floor. Then she looked back at the pot on the desk. "Dr. Lowe," she said, her voice mild but insistent, you say she has been dead perhaps 15 minutes?" "Roughly. Why?" "Because," Miss Marple said, staring at the silver vessel, "if she died 15 minutes ago, before Mary arrived with the fresh tray, then who brought her this pot?" She pointed to the teapot on the desk. "And more importantly," she continued, "why is it so hot that it blistered my finger? If she poured that cup 15 minutes ago and then died, the pot should be cooling, but it isn't." She touched the pot again quickly. "It is boiling," she whispered. Julian stepped into the room. Maybe she made it herself. "There is no kettle in here," Miss Marple said, "and Mary was in the kitchen boiling the water for the 4:30 tray. You were in the drawing room. The doctor was in the drawing room." She looked at the three of them. The silence stretched, tight and dangerous. "Someone," Miss Marple said, "brought this tea in here, very recently, and they did not want us to know." She looked down at the carpet. There, near the leg of the desk, was a tiny white object, a thimble. It must have rolled off the desk in a struggle, or perhaps it had been knocked over. A thimble of milk, a thimble of sewing, a thimble of evidence. "Don't touch anything," Miss Marple said. 4:45 p.m. Inspector Slack brought the storm inside with him. He entered the study like a wet dog shaking itself dry, his raincoat slick and dripping onto the Persian rug. The water pooled around his heavy boots, dark and invasive, soaking into the wool fibres with the persistence of a bad idea. He smelled of damp rubber and cheap tobacco, a sharp, aggressive scent that warred with the delicate lavender perfume of the dead woman. "Heart failure, you say?" Slack asked, peeling off his gloves with a wet snap. Dr. Lowe stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked tired, the lines around his mouth etched deep like cracks in old pavement. "She had a condition, Inspector. Angina. I've been treating her for 5 years. The excitement of the will change, the storm, it was a textbook trigger." Slack grunted. He walked over to the body, his boots squeaking. He looked at Lady Althea with the dispassionate gaze of a man who viewed death as paperwork. He touched her wrist, verified the lack of a pulse, and then looked around the room. "And the niece found her?" "The companion," Julian corrected from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, holding a glass of amber liquid that trembled slightly in his grip. "Mary, she's in the kitchen, hysterical." "I'm afraid." "I see." Slack pulled a notebook from his pocket. The pages were damp, curling at the edges. "Well, looks straightforward enough. Doctor signs the certificate, we notify the coroner, standard procedure." "Inspector," a soft voice said. Slack turned. He had not noticed the elderly woman sitting in the corner chair, her knitting bag on her lap. She blended into the upholstery like a faded cushion. "Miss Marple," Slack said, not hiding his irritation. "I didn't know you were here. I suppose you've already solved the crime before I even stepped through the door." "There is no crime to solve if it is heart failure, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with a sort of mild amusement. "But one does wonder about the thermodynamics." "The what?" "The tea," she said, pointing a knitting needle at the silver pot on the desk. "Ah, it is a matter of heat, you see. A domestic matter. And domestic matters are governed by laws just as immutable as the laws of physics." Slack sighed, a sound like a tire deflating. He walked over to the desk and hovered his hand over the teapot. It was still warm, radiating a gentle heat that he could feel against his palm. "It's warm," Slack said. "So, it is too warm," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Dr. Lowe estimates the time of death at roughly 4:15. Mary brought the tray at 4:30. But this specific pot, was already here. If Lady Althea poured herself a cup at 4 o'clock, as the timeline suggests, the pot should be stone cold by now. Silver is a conductive metal, Inspector. It surrenders its heat quite generously." She mimicked the motion of heat escaping with her hand, a fluttering gesture like a bird taking flight. "Perhaps she had a cozy on it," Slack said, looking around. "Maybe someone took it off." "There is no cozy in the room," Miss Marple said, "and Lady Althea detested them. She said they looked like woolen hats for invalids." Slack stared at the pot. He touched the side of it with one finger. It was hot, not burning any more, but significantly hotter than the room. "Curious," he muttered, though he sounded more annoyed than intrigued. "But hardly proof of murder, Miss Marple. Perhaps the doctor's time of death is off." Dr. Lowe stiffened. "My estimation is based on body temperature and rigor, Inspector. It is accurate." "Then we have a hot pot and a cold body," Slack said, shrugging. "A puzzle for the kitchen staff, not the police. Unless you're suggesting the tea killed her." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, picking up a stitch, "that the tea is a liar." Slack rolled his eyes. He turned his back on her, dismissing the observation as the ramblings of a spinster who spent too much time thinking about beverages. He focused on Julian. "I'll need statements from everyone. Where you were, what you were doing, just for the file." Julian nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "Of course. Anything to get this over with." "Let's do it in the drawing room," Slack said. "This room is too—" He looked at the dead woman. "Crowded." He marched out, his wet coat flapping. He ignored her. 5:30 p.m. The drawing room felt colder now. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing like angry red eyes in the grate. Inspector Slack sat on the sofa, his notebook open. A young constable, who had arrived 10 minutes after Slack, stood by the door, trying not to drip water on the parquet floor. Julian sat in the wingback chair, his legs crossed. He had regained some of his composure, though his eyes kept darting to the door as if he expected Althea to walk in and scold him for his posture. "I was in the garden," Julian said, "smoking. Aunt Althea hated the smell of cigarettes." "In the rain?" Slack asked, pen hovering. "It hadn't started raining when I went out. It was just threatening. I stood under the eaves of the folly when it started to drizzle. I stayed there until the thunder got too close. Then I came back in." "What time was that?" "Roughly 4:20, Julian said. "I came straight to the drawing room. Dr. Lowe was here. He can vouch for me." Slack looked at the doctor. "He came in at 4:20, yes, doctor." Lowe confirmed. He was polishing his spectacles with a handkerchief, the motion circular and soothing. He was agitated, understandably. The threat of disinheritance is a powerful stimulant. "And you, Doctor?" "I was here the entire time," Lowe said. "Reading The Lancet. I didn't leave the room from 3:30 until we heard Mary scream." "So, the victim was alone in the study from 4 o'clock until 4:30, Slack summarized, "with the door closed." "Yes." Slack turned to Mary. The companion was sitting on a low stool, her hands clutching a damp ball of linen. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked like a piece of laundry that had been wrung out too hard. "And you, miss?" "I was in the kitchen," Mary whispered, "boiling the water. Lady Althea was very particular. The water must be boiling when it hits the leaves, and not a moment before, not a moment after." "And you didn't go into the study before 4:30? "No, sir. I wouldn't dare. She gave strict orders." Miss Marple watched them from her corner. She was not knitting now. She was holding a small piece of fabric she had retrieved from her bag, a lace doily she was ostensibly examining for a tear. But her eyes were on Julian's shoes. They were potent leather, shiny, expensive, and they were dry. "Mr. Vance," Miss Marple said softly, "you said you were under the eaves of the Folly." Julian looked at her, startled. "Yes, why? The Folly is stone," she said, "and the path to it is gravel. Yet your shoes are quite pristine. Usually, gravel leaves a scuff, and the grass, well, the grass is wet." Julian shifted his feet, tucking them slightly under the chair. "I walked on the paving stones. I was careful." "Most commendable," Miss Marple said. "Men are rarely so careful with their footwear in a crisis. It reminds me of young Thomas Beresford in the village. He claimed to have walked through the muddy field to save a kitten, yet his boots were clean. It turned out he had merely bought a new kitten from the pet shop to replace the one he'd lost." "Are you comparing me to a lying schoolboy, Miss Marple?" Julian snapped. "I am comparing human nature to human nature," she said. "It is remarkably consistent." Slack frowned. He looked at Julian's shoes, then back at his notebook. He didn't like Miss Marple, but he knew from painful experience that when she noticed shoes, she was usually onto something. "Did anyone else have access to the house?" Slack asked. "Service entrance, back door." "It was locked," Mary said. "Yeah, I locked it myself after the grocery boy left at 2. "So, it's just the 4 of you," Slack said. 3 living, 1 dead." He stood up and walked over to the side table where a decanter of brandy sat. He picked up the stopper and sniffed it, a habit from his vice squad days. "Dr. Lowe," Slack said, turning back, "you're absolutely certain about the heart failure. No chance of something else?" "I will conduct a full examination, of course," Dr. Lowe said, putting his glasses back on. "But the symptoms are classic. The cyanosis, the position of the body, and her history. It is the most logical explanation." "Logical," Miss Marple murmured. "But is it true?" She stood up, her joints popping slightly. A dry sound like twigs snapping. "Inspector, might I have a closer look at that tea? And the one in the study?" "If you must," Slack waved a hand. "Just don't contaminate my crime scene." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it," she said. "I merely wish to smell it." She walked to the door. As she passed Julian, she paused. She reached out and patted his arm, a gesture of apparent comfort. "Do try to relax, Mr. Vance," she said. "You feel quite tense, like a tightly wound bobbin." Her hand lingered on his sleeve for a fraction of a second too long. The wool of his jacket was rough under her fingertips, and it was damp. Not wet like the inspector's coat, just damp. a localized dampness right near the cuff, as if he had spilled something and tried to sponge it off. "Thank you, Miss Marple," Julian said stiffly, pulling his arm away. She smiled, a sweet grandmotherly smile that didn't reach her eyes. She walked out into the hall, her mind racing. Dry shoes, damp sleeve, hot tea. It didn't fit. 5:45 p.m. The study was quiet now, the body having been moved to the sofa and covered with a sheet. The room felt empty, stripped of the tyrannical presence that had filled it only an hour ago. Miss Marple approached the desk. The silver teapot was still there. She leaned over and lifted the lid. A plume of steam escaped, fainter now, but still present. It curled into the air, a ghostly ribbon. She inhaled. The scent hit her immediately. It was strong, malty, and rich. It smelled of earth and heavy mornings. It was a robust smell, a working man's tea. Assam. Lady Althea had specifically asked for Earl Grey. She had berated Mary about it. Althea was a woman of ritual. She would never have brewed Assam for herself. So the killer had made the tea, and Miss Marple looked at the tray on the floor, the one Mary had dropped. She crouched down, her knees protesting, and picked up a shard of the broken cup. A few dregs of liquid clung to the porcelain. She sniffed it. Bergamot, citrus, floral, Earl Grey. The tea Mary brought, the fresh tea, was Earl Grey. The tea on the desk, the old tea, was Assam. The killer had made a mistake. A simple domestic error, born of haste. They had grabbed the wrong tin from the kitchen shelf. Miss Marple stood up, holding the shard of china like a relic. "Julian drinks Assam," she whispered to herself. She remembered him in the garden spinning his ring, saying, "Tea is tea, I'm not particular." But he was particular, he was lying. She looked around the floor. The thimble was still there, near the leg of the chair. She hadn't examined it closely before, and now she did. It wasn't a sewing thimble. It was a small antique silver measure, a spirit thimble used for pouring precise amounts of alcohol. Julian carried a flask. She had seen the outline of it in his pocket. She pictured him here. The panic, the rush, the need to establish a timeline. He kills her at 4. He needs it to look like 4:30. He runs to the kitchen while Mary is busy, boils water, grabs a tin, makes tea. He rushes back. He plants the hot pot. But in his haste, he spills. He wipes his sleeve. He drops his measure. She looked at the silver cup on the floor. A thimble of brandy for the shock, or a thimble of courage before the act. She reached down and picked it up with her handkerchief. It was light, cold, and damning. She smiled. The next morning, 8 a.m. The morning light at Greystone Manor was not so much a revelation as it was an interrogation. It stripped away the shadows of the storm, leaving the house exposed, grey and haggard. The rain had ceased, but the damp remained, clinging to the velvet curtains and the heavy oak panelling like a bad memory. In the breakfast room, the mood was brittle. The silence was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that occurs after a plate has been dropped, but before anyone has swept up the pieces. Miss Marple sat at the round table, her posture upright, her attention seemingly focused entirely on the toast rack. She buttered a slice with precision, spreading the yellow fat to the very edges of the crust. "Marmalade?" Dr. Lowe offered. He looked terrible. His skin was the colour of old parchment, and his eyes, usually so clinical, were bloodshot and weary. "Thank you, Doctor," Miss Marple said. "I always find marmalade settles the nerves. It reminds me of Mrs. Pants, the baker's wife. She made the most terrible marmalade, mostly peel, very little jelly. But she insisted it was a cure for everything from gout to a guilty conscience. Julian Vance, seated opposite, dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the china. "Must we?" Julian snapped. "Talk about confectionery? My aunt is lying dead in the next room." "In the parlour, actually," Dr. Lowe corrected automatically. "The undertaker arrives at 10. Julian pushed his plate away. His eggs were untouched, the yolks congealing into rubbery yellow eyes. He was wearing a fresh suit, a sharp navy serge, but his hands were shaking. He picked up his coffee cup, his fingers white against the handle. "I don't know how you can eat," Julian muttered to Miss Marple. "It's ghoulish." "One must keep one's strength up," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Investigations are tiring work, like spring cleaning. One finds all sorts of dust in corners one thought were clean." She took a bite of toast. The crunch was deafening. "There is no investigation," Julian said, his voice rising slightly. "Slack said it was heart failure. Natural causes. The will wasn't signed. The estate comes to me. It's tragic, yes, but simple." "Simple," Miss Marple repeated. She looked at the milk jug in the centre of the table. "Yes, I suppose it looks that way. Like a stocking that appears smooth until you find the run at the heel." She reached for the milk jug to add a splash to her tea. She tipped it carefully, watching the white liquid swirl into the dark brew. "Just a thimble," she murmured. "I don't like to cool it down too much." Julian flinched at the word cool. He stared at her tea, mesmerized by the steam rising from it. "Tell me, Mr. Vance," Miss Marple said, stirring her cup. "You are fond of Assam tea, are you not?" Yes, I suppose. Why?" "Strong, malty. A man's tea," she said. Lady Althea preferred Earl Grey, a delicate blend, very distinct aromas. It is quite impossible to mistake one for the other, don't you think?" "I wouldn't know," Julian said, looking away. "I leave the domestic details to Mary." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Mary, where is she?" "Packing," Dr. Lowe said. "She was dismissed, effectively. She feels she has no place here now." "Dismissed?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "But surely, with the new will unsigned, the old will stands. And in the old will, didn't Lady Althea leave Mary a small annuity?" Julian's face hardened. It was a subtle shift, like a door locking. "A pittance," Julian said. "Enough for a train ticket, perhaps. I intend to be generous, of course, eventually." Miss Marple dabbed her mouth with a napkin. She had seen what she needed to see. Julian was not grieving, he was calculating. He was a man counting his chips before the wheel had stopped spinning. "I think," Miss Marple said, standing up, "I shall go and offer Mary my condolences. It is the Christian thing to do." She left the room. She knew, 9:15 a.m. The kitchen was a vast subterranean space of copper pots and stone flags. It smelled of bacon grease and lye soap. Mary was standing by the sink, weeping softly into a dish rag. A suitcase, battered and bound with string, stood by the back door. There, Miss Marple said, bustling in. "Tears won't wash the dishes, as my mother used to say, though they do clear the sinuses." Mary looked up, her face blotchy. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all my fault." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said briskly. "You didn't stop her heart, my dear." "But I upset her. The tea, if I'd been faster." "The tea," Miss Marple said, moving towards the pantry. "Yes, let us talk about the tea. You said you were boiling water." "Yes, miss. The kettle takes 5 minutes. I watched the clock." "And the tea caddies?" Miss Marple asked, opening the pantry door. "Where are they kept?" Top shelf for the Earl Grey, Mary sniffed. Her ladyship insisted. Said it kept the damp out. The Assam and the builder's tea are on the counter. He's in the red tins, Miss Marple looked. On the high shelf, reachable only by a step-stool, was a blue tin labelled Earl Grey. It was dusty. On the counter, easily accessible, was a red tin labelled Assam. Miss Marple opened the red tin. Inside, a silver spoon was buried in the dark curled leaves. She pulled it out. The spoon was damp. A few wet grains of tea clung to the handle. Mary, Miss Marple said, holding up the spoon, do you leave the spoon in the tin? Never, Mary looked shocked. It rusts the metal, and it spoils the flavour. Lady Althea would have boxed my ears. And yet, Miss Marple said, here it is, damp. As if someone scooped tea in a great hurry with a wet hand, or perhaps dropped the spoon into a wet sink and put it back without drying it. She looked at the counter. There were a few scattered grains of black tea. Tiny, dark commas on the white marble. Someone made tea here, Miss Marple said softly. Someone who didn't know, or didn't care, to use the step-stool for the Earl Grey. Someone who grabbed the nearest tin, the red one, and brewed a pot of Assam. But I made the Earl Grey, Mary stammered, for the 4:30 tray. I know you did, dear, Miss Marple said. This pot was made earlier, around 4:15, by someone who needed a prop. She closed the tin with a snap. Mary, did Julian come into the kitchen yesterday? Mr. Julian? No, he never comes down here. He says it smells of onions. And the back door? Locked, I told the inspector. Miss Marple walked to the back door. She tried the handle. It was firm. She looked at the floor near the threshold. The stone flags were clean. You mopped yesterday? Yes, miss. After lunch. Good girl, Miss Marple smiled. You are very thorough, unlike the person who made that tea. She patted Mary's arm. Don't leave just yet, my dear. I think the inspector might want to ask you about the spoon. The spoon? The spoon, Miss Marple said. It speaks. 10:30 a.m. The garden was breathing. That was how it felt to Miss Marple as she walked along the gravel path. The earth, soaked by the storm, was exhaling a mist that curled around the rose bushes and the stone statues. She was looking for something specific. If Julian, or whoever the killer was, had replaced the tea, they had to dispose of the old tea. The real tea. The cup Lady Althea had been drinking when she died. She couldn't have poured it down the sink in the study. There was no sink. She couldn't have taken it to the kitchen. Mary was there, the window, and the study window had been cracked open. Miss Marple navigated the wet lawn, her galoshes squelching in the mud. She made her way to the flower bed directly beneath the study window. The hydrangeas were brown and dying, their heavy heads bowing to the ground. Miss Marple pushed aside a branch of wet leaves. There, splashed across the dark soil, and the leaves of a hosta plant was a stain, a dark amber stain, and amidst the mud, glinting slightly, were tea leaves. She leaned down, her knees cracking. She pinched a few of the wet leaves between her thumb and forefinger. She brought them to her nose. Citrus, bergamot, Earl Grey. So, the timeline was clear now. 4 p.m. Lady Althea is alive. She pours herself a cup of Earl Grey. 4:15 p.m. The killer enters, murders her. The problem, the tea she poured is now cooling. If the body is found at 4:30, the cold tea will reveal she died earlier. The solution, toss the cold Earl Grey out the window, rush to the kitchen, make a fresh boiling pot, accidentally using Assam. Plant it on the desk. The result, when Mary enters at 4:30, the pot is hot. It looks like Althea was just alive. It was clever, Very clever. A trick of temperature to fool the clock. But the killer had forgotten that nature keeps its own accounts. The soil had caught the tea. The Assam tin held the damp spoon. And the heat had been too aggressive. Gardening, a voice said, at a time like this. Miss Marple straightened up. Dr. Lowe was standing on the path, watching her. He was wearing a heavy tweed coat and leaning on a cane. Nature does not stop for death, Doctor, Miss Marple said, wiping her fingers on her handkerchief. Oh, the weeds still grow. The truth still surfaces. You found something, Lowe said. It wasn't a question. I found the first cup of tea, she said, pointing to the hosta. The one she was drinking when she died. Lowe looked at the plant. His face was unreadable. His eyes, those grey eyes, seemed to shift in the mist, looking darker, almost charcoal. You are a dangerous woman, Jane, he said quietly. I am merely an observer, Doctor. I observed that Julian's shoes were dry, yet he claimed to be in the folly. I observed that the tea in the study was Assam, yet Althea drank Earl Grey. And I observed that you, who have known Althea for 20 years, signed a death certificate for heart failure without so much as a blood test. Lowe stepped closer. He gripped his cane tightly. The silver head of the cane dug into his palm. Althea was a monster, Lowe said. His voice was low, trembling with a suppressed rage that startled her. Do you know what she did? She enjoyed it. She enjoyed dangling that money over Julian's head. She enjoyed treating Mary like a slave. She enjoyed humiliating me, humiliating you. She knew, Lowe whispered. She knew about certain errors in my past. She held them over me. Keep me alive, Doctor, she would say, or I shall tell the medical board about 1938. Miss Marple watched him. A motive, a powerful one. But you didn't kill her, Miss Marple said. Lowe blinked. What? You didn't kill her, she repeated. You are relieved she is dead. You are covering for the killer, perhaps. You turned a blind eye to the medical anomalies because her death frees you. But you didn't pour the tea. How do you know? Because, Miss Marple said, smiling a small, sad smile, you are a doctor. You know that boiling water scalds the esophagus. If you had staged the scene, you would have let the tea cool to a drinkable temperature before placing it there. Only a man who never makes his own tea, a man like Julian, would think hotter is better, and leave a pot that was physically impossible to drink. Lowe let out a breath. It was a long, shuddering sound. He did it, Lowe whispered. I saw him. Coming out of the study, he looked wild. And you said nothing. I checked her pulse. She was gone, and I thought, good riddance. Silence is a form of complicity, Doctor, Miss Marple said sternly, but it is not murder. She looked back at the house. Aunt Julian was standing in the window of the drawing room, watching them. He looked like a ghost in a glass cage. We must call Inspector Slack, Miss Marple said. The tea party is over. It ended. 2 p.m. The library smelled of dust and unread history. It was a room that felt suspended in time, a place where the clocks seemed to tick slower than in the rest of the world, dragging each second out until it felt like a minute. Miss Marple sat near the window, the grey light of the afternoon filtering through the lace curtains to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air. Tiny, suspended galaxies of skin and fabric. She was not knitting now. She was watching Julian Vance. Julian was building a house of cards on the green baize of the card table. His hands were steady enough, but there was a sheen of perspiration on his upper lip that betrayed him. He placed a jack of diamonds on top of a queen of hearts. balancing the edges with the delicate touch of a surgeon or a pickpocket. The cards leaned, threatened to fall, then held. "You have a steady hand, Mr. Vance," Miss Marple observed. "Remarkable for a man under such strain." Julian did not look up. "It's a matter of breath control, Miss Marple. One must hold one's breath at the crucial moment. If you exhale too soon, the whole structure collapses." "Like a lie," she said pleasantly. The house of cards trembled. Julian's finger twitched, knocking the queen. The structure folded in on itself, a cascading ruin of paper faces sliding onto the green felt with a soft shush sound. "You have a very unsettling way of speaking," Julian said, sweeping the cards into a pile. "You wrap accusations in knitting wool and serve them with tea." "I merely observe," Miss Marple said. "I observe that you are waiting for the telephone to ring. You have looked at it 4 times in the last 10 minutes. Are you expecting news?" "I'm expecting my lawyer," Julian snapped. "The estate is in chaos. Althea didn't sign the new will, but the old one is complex." Dr. Lowe entered the room then, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a soft click. He looked haggard, his tweed jacket rumpled as if he had slept in it. He walked to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked garden, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "Slack is coming back," Lowe said. "He called. The preliminary report is done." "And?" Julian asked, abandoning the cards. "Indeterminate," Lowe said, turning around. "Well, they found no poison in the stomach contents, no obvious trauma. The heart showed signs of disease, as I said. But Slack is suspicious. He doesn't like the timeline." Miss Marple looked at the doctor. The afternoon light caught his face, highlighting the deep grooves of stress around his mouth and the dark circles under his eyes. "You look tired, Doctor," she said. He took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. When he looked at her again, Miss Marple blinked. His eyes, which she had noted as a piercing steel grey yesterday, now appeared to be a muddy hazel, brownish-green with flecks of gold. Perhaps it was the light in the library, or perhaps it was the change in his demeanour, the way the arrogance had drained out of him, leaving only fear. "I am tired," Lowe said, his hazel eyes dull. "I am tired of this house. I am tired of the rain. I am tired of death." "Death is tiring," Miss Marple agreed. "It demands so much of the living. Explanations, grief, or the performance of grief." Julian stood up, knocking his chair back. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. "I'm going to have a drink," he announced. "A proper one. None of this tea nonsense." He walked to the drinks cabinet. He poured himself a generous measure of brandy, filling the crystal tumbler until it was nearly brimming. He did not use the silver measure, the thimble, this time. He poured freehand, splashing a little on the wood. "Will you join me, Doctor?" Julian asked. "No," Lowe said. "I need a clear head." "Suit yourself." Julian took a long swallow, the amber liquid disappearing. "Miss Marple, a thimble of sherry." "No, thank you," she said. "I prefer to keep my wits about me. Alcohol has a way of blurring the edges of things, doesn't it? And edges are so very important right now." Julian laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You and your edges. You think you see everything, don't you? The little old lady in the corner. But you don't know what it was like. Living with her. She suffocated us. She controlled every breath, every penny, every minute." "And so you stopped the clock," Miss Marple said softly. The room went very quiet. The only sound was the rain beginning to tap against the glass again. a rhythmic drumming that sounded like fingertips on a table. "I didn't kill her," Julian said. He lowered the glass. "I hated her. Yes, I wanted her dead. Yes, but I didn't kill her." "Then who made the tea?" Miss Marple asked. "What tea?" "The Assam," she said. "Oh, the boiling hot pot of Assam tea that was sitting on her desk. The one you claim to know nothing about." Julian stared at her. The glass shook in his hand. "I don't know," he whispered. "Maybe Mary. Mary knows the difference between Assam and Earl Grey," Miss Marple said. "You, by your own admission, do not. And Mary would never have used a wet spoon." Julian looked at Dr. Lowe. The doctor looked away, focusing on the spine of a leather-bound encyclopedia. "It's just tea," Julian said, his voice rising. "It proves nothing. It proves time," Miss Marple said, "and time is the only witness that cannot be bribed." Time shifted. 2:45 p.m. Inspector Slack arrived with the subtlety of a battering ram. He strode into the library, shaking water from his hat, his face set in a grim expression that suggested he had missed his lunch and was blaming the universe for it. Behind him, the young constable carried a large manila envelope. "Right," Slack said, tossing his hat onto a chair. "Sit down, all of you." They sat. The atmosphere was that of a headmaster's study before a caning. "We have the initial findings," Slack said, tapping the envelope. "Dr. Lowe, your diagnosis of heart failure stands, anatomically speaking." Julian exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. "Thank God." "However," Slack continued, his voice hardening, "toxicology is pending, and we found something interesting in the garden." He looked at Miss Marple. She smiled, a small knitting circle smile that concealed a mind like a steel trap. "A stain," Slack said, "beneath the study window. Tea, Earl Grey to be precise, ash and footprints in the mud." Julian's face went pale. "Footprints? Men's shoes," Slack said. "Size 9, expensive soles, not much tread." He looked at Julian's feet. "I wear a 9, Julian said quickly, "but so does half the population. And I was in the garden, I told you." "You said you were in the folly," Slack corrected. "The folly is on the east side. The study window is on the west. To get to the study window, you would have to cross the lawn, which would explain why your shoes were clean when you came in. The grass wipes the mud off the soles, but the dampness remains." "This is circumstantial," Julian cried. "You have no weapon, no poison, just tea stains." "And the teapot," Miss Marple interjected. Slack turned to her. "Yes, the teapot. I must admit, Miss Marple, your observation bothered me. I had the boys run a test back at the station." "A test?" Julian asked. "Thermodynamics," Slack said, enjoying the word. "We boiled a similar silver pot, filled it, left it in a room of this temperature for 30 minutes. Do you know what the temperature of the water was after 30 minutes? Nobody spoke. "Lukewarm," Slack said. "Tepid, drinkable, but barely. Certainly not hot enough to blister a finger." He turned to the constable. "Show them." The constable produced a thermometer from his pocket. "The pot on the desk," Slack said, "was 190 degrees when Miss Marple touched it, or near enough, which means it had been off the boil for less than 5 minutes." "So," Julian said, "so she made tea just before she died?" "No," Miss Marple said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room like a bell. Because Mary brought the tray at 4:30, and Althea was dead then. The doctor said she died at 4:15. If she made tea at 4:10 and died at 4:15, the pot would be cooling by 4:30. It would not be boiling." She leaned forward. The only way the pot could be that hot at 4:30, she said, is if someone made it at 4:25, after she was dead, to create the illusion that she was still alive. Julian looked trapped. He looked at the door, then at the window. But if she was dead, Julian stammered, why make tea? Why not just leave her? Because of the will, Miss Marple said. Mr. Henderson was coming at 6. If she died of natural causes just before the lawyer arrived, questions might be asked. But if she was seen alive, drinking tea, happy and well, it looks like a sudden tragedy, a seamless transition. But she wasn't seen alive, Julian argued. No, Miss Marple said, but the scene was set for her to be found. The tea was the actor. It was meant to say, I was just here. But the actor missed his cue. The tea was too hot. It overacted. Slack looked at Julian. Mr. Vance, I'd like you to account for your movements between 4:15 and 4:25 again, and be very careful. Julian stood up. His hands were shaking violently now. I didn't do it. I didn't touch her. I was... You were what? Slack barked. I was in the pantry, Julian shouted. Silence. The pantry? Slack asked. I needed a drink, Julian cried. I have a flask. It was empty. I went to the pantry to refill it from the cooking brandy. I didn't want Althea to know, but she counted the bottles in the drawing room. And did you see anyone? Miss Marple asked. No. I was in there for 5 minutes. I filled the flask. I had a nip, just a thimble to steady my nerves. Then I went back to the garden. You went to the pantry, Miss Marple repeated slowly, where the tea tins are kept. I didn't touch the tea. But you were there, she said, at the exact moment the killer would have needed to be there to boil the water. I suppose. And did you see the kettle? Julian blinked. He looked confused. The kettle? Yes, it was on the stove. It was whistling, faintly. Whistling? Mary had said she put the kettle on at 4:20. Yes, it was steaming. So someone had put it on before Mary came in, Miss Marple said. Interesting. She looked at Dr. Lowe. Doctor, she said. You were in the drawing room, reading. Yes, Lowe said. His voice was tight. Did you hear the whistle? No, Lowe said quickly. The storm, the thunder, it was very loud. Strange, Miss Marple said. Julian heard it in the pantry. You were closer to the kitchen than he was. Lowe adjusted his cuffs. I was concentrating. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said, you were not in the drawing room. He doubted. 3:30 p.m. The trap was simple, as all good traps are. Miss Marple had asked permission to use the kitchen. Slack, bewildered but desperate for a lead, had agreed. She had assembled them all in the drawing room again. On the low table in the centre of the room, she placed 3 items. A silver teapot, the one from the study. A kettle of boiling water. A stopwatch. We are going to conduct an experiment, Miss Marple announced. She looked like a schoolmistress about to teach a lesson on gravity. Is this necessary? Julian groaned. He had sunk into a sullen silence, nursing his brandy. Vital, she said. We need to establish the rate of cooling. It is a scientific term Inspector Slack used. I find it quite poetic. Everything cools, eventually. Tea, passion, anger, even the body. She poured the boiling water into the silver pot. Steam billowed up, hot and aggressive. Mark the time, Inspector, she said. Slack looked at his watch. 3:32. Good. Now we wait. We wait exactly 15 minutes, the time between the alleged death and the discovery. The room settled into an uneasy silence. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a bruised purple. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting needles clicking. While we wait, she said, I have been thinking about the thimble I found on the floor. The silver measure. Julian looked up. I told you, I dropped it. Yes, she said, but it was found near the desk, in the study. You said you were in the pantry. Julian paused. I must have gone into the study earlier, to ask Althea for money, before the tea. Ah, she said, so you were in the study. Earlier, at 3:30. And she was alive then? Of course she was. She yelled at me. And was she drinking tea then? No, she was writing, working on the draft of the new will. Writing, Miss Marple mused, with a fountain pen. Yes. And yet, Miss Marple said, knitting a pearl stitch, when we found her, there was no pen on the desk, just the teapot, and the will was nowhere to be seen. Slack sat up straight. Oh, the will wasn't there. I didn't see it, Miss Marple said. Did you, Inspector? No, Slack said slowly. Just the blotter. So, Miss Marple said, the killer didn't just swap the tea. They took the draft of the will, the document that disinherited everyone. She looked at Dr. Lowe. Doctor, you arrived first at the body. Did you see a paper? No, Lowe said. The desk was bare. Curious, Miss Marple said. Althea was obsessive. She wouldn't have put it away if she was working on it, unless, she paused. Unless she wasn't working on it, Miss Marple said. Unless she had already finished it, and someone destroyed it. She looked at the teapot. 10 minutes, she said. Let us test the heat. She reached out and touched the pot. Still quite hot, she said, but touchable, not blistering. She looked at Julian. Mr. Vance, your hands are shaking. It makes it hard to hold small things, like a thimble, or a pen, or a packet of poison. I didn't poison her, Julian screamed. There was no poison. I know, Miss Marple said calmly. That is the cleverest part. There was no poison in the tea. That is why the toxicology will come back clean. She stood up. The weapon wasn't in the cup, Inspector. The weapon was the cup. The trap set. 4 p.m. The silence in the drawing room was absolute. A vacuum created by the sudden intake of breath from everyone present. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and a world that dripped with the melancholy of aftermath. Inside, the fire crackled, oblivious to the human drama unfolding before it. Miss Marple stood by the low table. The silver teapot sat there, steaming gently, an inanimate witness now turned accuser. The weapon was the cup, Inspector Slack repeated, his brow furrowed. But if there was no poison, it is a matter of sequence, Inspector, Miss Marple said, her voice calm and pedagogical. We have been assuming the tea was the vehicle for death. But what if the tea was merely the curtain that hid the act? She looked at Julian Vance. He was staring at the teapot as if it were a coiled snake. Mr. Vance, she said, you were in the pantry. You admitted it. You saw the kettle. Yes, Julian cried, but I didn't touch it. No, Miss Marple agreed. You didn't, because you didn't need to. You were not the one trying to rewrite the timeline. She turned slowly, her gaze resting on Dr. Lowe. The doctor was standing by the window, his back to the room. He was very still. His hands were clasped behind his back, the fingers interlocking so tightly the knuckles were white. Doctor, Miss Marple said softly, you arrived first at the body. You pronounced her dead. You set the time of death at 4:15. You were adamant about it. Lowe did not turn. It was a medical fact. It was a convenient fiction, Miss Marple said, because if she died at 4:15, before Mary brought the fresh tea, then the presence of the hot pot becomes a mystery. A mystery that points to someone else, someone clumsy, Someone desperate, someone like Julian. Lowe turned around. His face was a mask of weary indifference. And how, pray tell, did I kill her without poison? Without a weapon? With words, Miss Marple said, and perhaps with a pillow. The room gasped. A pillow? Slack asked. Soft, efficient. It leaves no marks on an elderly woman with a weak heart, Miss Marple explained. But more importantly, it allows one to control the exact moment of death, to ensure it happens before the will is signed. You have no proof, Lowe said. His voice was steady, but his eyes, those treacherous hazel eyes, betrayed him. They darted to the door. Proof, Miss Marple mused. Yes, that is always the difficulty, unless one considers the tea leaves. She reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully to reveal the few damp, dark leaves she had collected from the garden. These are Earl Grey, she said, from the cup Althea drank at 4 o'clock. The cup you threw out the window, Doctor. I was in the drawing room, Lowe shouted. Were you? Miss Marple asked. Oh, you said you were reading the Lancet. But when I came in earlier, the journal was upside down on the sofa. A small detail, but telling. You were agitated. You were waiting. She walked towards him. You knew about the will. You knew Althea was going to cut Julian off. But you also knew she was going to expose you. You told me yourself in the garden. She held your past over you. Keep me alive, Doctor, she said. But if she died, you were free. Lowe laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. This is absurd. Why would I frame Julian with the tea? Why make it hot? Because, Miss Marple said, you needed to confuse the timeline. You killed her at 4:15. You threw out her cold tea. You ran to the kitchen. The service stairs are just down the hall from the study, are they not? And you put the kettle on. As you grabbed the first tin you saw. You didn't know the difference between Assam and Earl Grey. You are a coffee drinker, Doctor. I've watched you at breakfast. Lowe flinched. You made the tea, she continued, her voice relentless. You brought it back. You placed it on the desk. You wanted it to look like she had just been served. But you made it too hot. You didn't account for the silver. You didn't account for the specific heat capacity of metal. You are a man of biology, not physics. And the thimble? Julian asked, his voice trembling. My measure? You dropped it, Miss Marple said to Julian, earlier, when you went to ask her for money. The doctor found it, and he left it there, a convenient piece of evidence to point to you. Lowe looked at the inspector. She's guessing. It's all conjecture. Is it? Miss Marple asked, as she pointed to Lowe's shoes. The garden is wet, Doctor, muddy. If you threw the tea out the window, you would have had to open the window. But to throw it clear of the sill, to avoid staining the stone, one would have to lean out, or perhaps step out. I never stepped out. Then explain, Miss Marple said, why there is a smear of green algae on your cuff. Lowe looked down at his left sleeve. There, faint but undeniable, was a streak of green moss, the kind that grows on the damp stone sill of the study window. You leaned out, Miss Marple said, to pour the tea into the flower bed, to hide the evidence that she had finished her cup long before 4:30. Lowe stared at the stain. He tried to brush it off, but the green was stubborn. It clung to the tweed like guilt. Lowe started. And, Miss Marple added gently, there is one more thing. The tea leaves in the garden. I found something else mixed in with them. She held up the paper again. A small, white pill, partially dissolved. Lowe froze. Her heart medication, Miss Marple said. She must have been taking it with her tea. If she died of natural heart failure, the pill would be in her stomach. But it was in the garden, which means she never swallowed it, which means she was interrupted. The silence stretched, thin and taut as a wire. She laughed at me, Lowe whispered. The confession came out like a sigh, a sudden deflation of the man. She sat there, Lowe said, staring at his hands. She told me she was going to put it in the will, a clause. To my physician, Dr. Lowe, I leave my silence regarding the incident of 1938. She was going to ruin me from the grave. Even after she cut Julian off, she wanted to destroy me too. So you smothered her, Slack said, stepping forward. I stopped her, Lowe said. I used the cushion from the sofa. It was quick. She didn't suffer. She just stopped. And the tea? Miss Marple asked. I panicked, Lowe said. I needed it to look normal. I needed a scene. I ran to the kitchen. I grabbed the red tin. I didn't know. I just didn't know. He looked at Miss Marple, his eyes pleading. It was just tea, he said. How could tea betray me? Tea is honest, Miss Marple said. It cools at a predictable rate. It smells of its origin. It leaves a stain. Unlike people, it never lies. Slack nodded to the constable. Dr. Lowe, I'm arresting you for the murder of Lady Althea Vance. You do not have to say anything. The words of the caution drifted through the room, familiar and final. The constable moved forward, taking Lowe by the arm. The doctor didn't resist. He looked small now, diminished, like a coat that has lost its wearer. As they led him out, Julian collapsed into the armchair. He buried his face in his hands. She was going to ruin us all, Julian sobbed. And now I have it all, and I don't want it. You will want it tomorrow, Miss Marple said, packing away her knitting. Grief is sharp, Mr. Vance, but avarice is durable. It outlasts almost everything. 5:30 p.m. The house was quiet again. Inspector Slack had gone, taking his prisoner and his damp notebook with him. The body had been removed. The tragedy was officially over, leaving only the paperwork and the silence. Miss Marple sat in the kitchen. It was the warmest room in the house. The stove was still hot. Mary was there, making a fresh pot of tea, proper tea this time. He was always so kind to me, Mary said, wiping her eyes. The doctor, he gave me pills for my headaches. Kindness can be a mask, my dear, Miss Marple said, just as cruelty can be honest. Lady Althea was cruel, but she was transparent. The doctor was kind, but he was opaque. Mary placed a cup in front of Miss Marple. It was bone china, delicate and translucent. Earl Grey, miss, Mary said. I made sure. Thank you, Mary. Miss Marple lifted the cup. The steam rose in a perfect vertical column. She inhaled the scent, citrus, bergamot, and the faint underlying smell of peace. She took a sip. It was hot, perfect. You know, Miss Marple said, I once knew a man in Saint. He Mary Mead, Mr. Argyle. He tried to fake his own death to escape his creditors. He left a pile of clothes on the beach and vanished, but he forgot one thing. What was that, miss? Mary asked, sitting opposite her. He forgot that he was wearing his reading glasses when he supposedly drowned, and he was blind as a bat without them. They found him 3 days later in a hotel in Brighton, unable to read the menu. Mary smiled, a weak, watery smile. People always forget the small things, Miss Marple said. They plan the grand gestures, the alibis, the motives, the wills, but they forget the spectacles, or the shoes, or the temperature of a teapot. She looked at the silver pot on the table. It was cooling now, its heat radiating into the room, warming the air just a fraction. Life is a series of small details, Miss Marple said. And death. Death is simply the final detail. She took another sip. And this, she said, closing her eyes, is a very good cup of tea. She reached for the milk jug. She poured just a thimble of milk into the dark liquid, watching it cloud and swirl, a tiny storm in a teacup that would soon settle. The truth had cooled. The end.